Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Dr. Michael R. Fisher Jr. Michael is assistant professor in the political economy of race and racism in the Department of African American and African Studies at the Ohio State University. He has research appointments at the Metropolitan Policy Center at American University, the National Initiative of Mixed Income Communities at Case Western Reserve University, and the Institute for Gender Studies at the University of South Africa. He's also a 2023-2025 Public Fellow with the Public Religion Research Institute, also known as PRRI, and a 2023 Pardee Rand Faculty Leader Fellow, and a 2022-23 Public Voices Fellow with the Op-Ed Project. He also serves as a founding steering committee member of the DC Legacy Project, Berry Farm, Hillsdale, a group dedicated to uplifting the Black-led struggle for land and housing in DC. Dr. Fisher is editor of a new book called Confronting Racism and White Supremacy in the U.S., 21st Century Theological Perspectives, which is a collection of essays on contemporary issues in the ongoing fight against racial oppression and inequality in the U.S., published by Friendship Press. Friendship Press. He's currently working on a first monograph titled Black Community Building, Public Housing Reform and the Promise of an Alternative Model to Mixed Income Neighborhoods. You can learn more about all of Michael's work at mrfisherjr.com. So Michael, thank you so much for joining us, and many congratulations on all your work.
Thank you, Brian. It's good to be in conversation with you.
Well, same here. Your book is quite an effort, and all of your work looks like it's much needed and probably difficult and challenging, though, as well.
It certainly takes a commitment and many nights of good rest to make up for the nights of no sleep where I'm thinking about a lot of these issues.
Well, we've got so many difficult and intractable problems in our country. And when I see someone who's actually doing something about it, not just talking about it, that is what really impresses me and encourages me about the future. So I'm very glad, for your work and actually doing something about it.
I appreciate it. I often think that, I often say, the struggle for justice, both economic, racial, gender, and the like, is best forged together. And so I'm just, one member of a team of folk globally, domestically, who are committed to helping to make this world a better place as much as one can in one's lifetime. So I'm within the tradition of justice advocates, and so I just kind of see myself extending the work that was begun before me.
Hmm. So, other than the things I touched on, is there anything else that you'd like people to know about you?
Um, I mean, you mentioned all, the main stuff. So I'm trained as an interdisciplinary scholar. Ethics and public policy is my large area of focus. I have two primary specializations in race policy and socioeconomic inequality in race and religion. So this project for the book that we'll be talking about today comes out of my race and religion work, and I could say more about that if there's an opportunity
Sure,
to.
absolutely. Absolutely. So I assume that you were happy about the national championship game?
Probably shouldn't say this, but I mean, I was happy for my students, right? I'm indifferent, but I was happy for my students because many of them were excited. I did not watch the game myself, and I told my students, win or lose, we would still be having class. Um, but I'm happy for them that we were able to bring home a championship. So go Bucks. I feel like that's obligatory. Go Bucks.
Yes, yes, yes. So, before we get into, your book that we're going to talk about, can you tell us more about, your teaching and your other work?
Yeah, so at Ohio State, I'm in the Black Studies department, technically named African American and African Studies. As you mentioned, my line is in the political economy of race and racism. And so basically in the department, I teach our classes on race, not exclusively so. Obviously have other colleagues who teach on similar topics. But in terms of the classes that I teach, they're primarily on some aspect of race. So this semester I'm teaching a class on theorizing race, looking at different theories for understanding what race is or has been or how it's been understood in the modern West. I teach that class quite often. I teach a class on race and public policy, which comes out of my own areas of expertise, looking at the intersections of race and primarily federal public policy, looking at how race shapes public policy and the like, and what we can do to kind of use public policy or to promote public policy that really addresses racial inequality and the like. I'm hoping to teach a class on race, wealth, and inequality in the United States that looks at the racial wealth gap and how that's been forged and framed, particularly in the context of the United States. I'm hoping to teach that in the next year or so. So generally speaking, my courses look at race along, or particularly in the context of the United States, but also abroad.
Hmm. So, how much of your course material has changed since the last election?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say that because I revised the syllabus for this current semester just at the end of December. But given what we had talked about, because I taught this course last autumn semester, and so given what we were talking about last autumn semester, I thought that, we could kind of continue the themes in the conversation because I think a lot of it, I mean, all of it really is still relevant, but particularly the political, some of the political events that we explore were, extended in this semester given the change in administration. So, um, it's timely. It's timely. Of course, like any course on race, I think, is timely, given that it's something that is always, we are shaped by it, the idea of race, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And so I think conversations about race are important, even as people are pushing against racial inequality and what they see as kind of, or what they understand to be kind of, reverse racism or something like it.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it's, as you said, I mean, it's been an important and needed conversation for centuries. But I'm perceiving that things are getting worse before they get better at this point.
We're in for a long few years. So, like gird your loins. I think, I mean, the writing has been on the wall for quite some time. So I think nothing that's happening in our contemporary moment should be a surprise to anyone who is paying any attention to what's been happening in the public discourse over the last several years.
Yeah, yeah, true, unfortunately. Well, anyway, let's get to the book. As I mentioned, the title is Confronting Racism and White Supremacy in the U.S., 21st Century Theological Perspectives. So what led you to pull together that book?
So I want to start by saying like this is not I don't see this as my book. This is work of the National Council of Churches. This work emerged out of the Faith and Order table on which I sit as a member. And that table is basically a group of scholars of religion, religious leaders, activists, um, staff of the National Council of Churches, all dedicated to engaging in the relevance of religion for the society in which we live. They have a long history of publishing books that stem or go back, at least as far as I'm aware, to the 1980s. So this was a work of the Faith and Order table that falls in a long line of scholarship that has come out of this very group over the last several decades. And so I was honored to not only sit at the table, but kind of be asked to kind of be the general editor for this work. And it has been, a labor of love. It's been nice to be able to engage with my colleagues on, issues of racism, white supremacy, not because it's a nice topic to discuss, but because I'm sitting at a table, both literally and figuratively, with people who are committed to pushing forward racial and economic justice.
Good, good. How many contributors are there in the book?
There are 19, including myself.
Okay. And who would you say the book is most intended for?
That's a good question. So we wrote this book for religious communities. It was written for a general audience. So we often had conversations as we were, putting together the structure, talking about the structure, and as I was encouraging our contributors to think about, the general public, right? But it's not just anyone in the general public. It's for people who have some sort of religious affiliation, who are interested in the role of religion. So it is an academic book, but we really wanted to make sure that it was relevant for people beyond the academy, beyond, seminary and divinity schools. Although, many of us wrote with seminary and divinity schools in mind. But really for religious communities, we might use the phrase on the ground, who are dealing with the everyday issues of racism, white supremacy, and its, tendrils, thinking through what this text could mean for them as they live out their daily lives.
Hmm. Well, I know you can't go through all 19 of the contributors, but could you give some examples of, some either the types of folks or
Yes,
specific?
so this is it's going to give me a little, but I'm trying not to get in trouble, right? So,
I understand. I understand.
Starting,
Who's your favorite
but I'll say,
child?
so there are 19 contributors, um, uh, you know, of people who span the gamut in terms of how they were trained. We've got biblical scholars, we've got theologians, we've got ethicists, we've got religious practitioners. So there are people in this volume, like Tony, um, who's the Associate General Secretary of the National Council of Churches. He's got a chapter in there. We've got Keith, who's also on staff at the National Council of Churches, who's got a chapter in there. Other people like Whitney Wilkinson Areche, who's a theologian and Presbyterian pastor, and is one of the associate editors, I should say, for this book, is on there. People from the Reformed Church in America. I mean, if I start naming names, they're going to really, and I've already started, right? So stop naming names so that when they see this, they're like, he didn't say my name. But there are just contributors from a gamut that have all, who all sit on the Faith and Order table, and have been working on this volume for the past several years.
Hmm, hmm. So the book's description says that it offers constructive theological reflection for resisting racism and white supremacy. So would you say it is more about analysis of the problem or more about what do we do about it?
I would say both. I think there are essays that provide insightful analyses of racism and white supremacy, and then essays that talk about like what can be done. Um, and then there are essays that kind of do both. So, for example, I am going to name at least one contributor. I might name a couple others in relationship to their chapter, right? Because I see it as an opportunity to feature some of the work that's in the book. So, for example, Tony Shavala Smith has a chapter entitled Racism and the Moral Logic of Incarnation, where he examines in detail why racism has consistently found a home in Christian churches.
Hmm,
And there in his essay, he argues that the fear of what he calls the other, in other with scare quotes, has nurtured in churches a refusal to embrace what he sees as the moral logic of the doctrine of incarnation that affirms the shared humanity of all people. And so for Tony, reclaiming the doctrine of incarnation is the foundation for an anti-racist orientation that resists racist structures in the world. And so what he's doing there is to say, racism has found a home in the Christian church, and there are reasons for this. And he provides some analysis for this, and then says, by embracing the doctrine of incarnation, here's how we can move towards what he is framing as anti-racist work to stamp out racism. So I think it's both analysis and, well, after an analysis, how can we act on this?
hmm. Good, good. I'd like to read from a couple of the endorsements for the book. This one is from Karen Georgia Thompson, CEO of the United Church of Christ Common Service Corporation, who says, this book is timely and calls the church once again to being an active participant in the eradication of racism. So I agree with that. However, in the United States, the church has been shrinking for decades, and it's not at all clear to me that a significant part of it really reflects what Jesus taught us. So do you think it's realistic for us to depend on the church to turn around the strength that we see of greed and racism in this time?
Well, I'll say that I think in the U.S. context, there have always been churches, religious communities that have engaged in pushing against forces of racism, white supremacy, fighting for justice, right? That there have been different pockets. Not to say that the church universal, has always done this, but if you are in traditions that, for example, value the social gospel, right? What is the meaning of the gospel of Jesus to the world, right? To the social world. If you come out of Black liberationist traditions that have always been fighting for racial justice, the liberation of oppressed people in the U.S. and abroad, then if you're familiar with this type of history, then you know that there are several traditions within the larger Christian camp of churches or religious communities that have been using their voice in the public sphere and putting, their hand on the plow to kind of try to furrow through and to disentangle a society from its racist structures. And so I say all that to say that I think that there is a significant tradition, religious tradition in the United States of religious communities who are fighting against racism, who have been fighting for generations against racism and white supremacy, and trying to imagine that a different world, right? In the United Church of Christ, one of the taglines is "Another world is possible," and the United Church of Christ is, I think, one of those uh, denominations within the Christian tradition that has um, tried to and has put a lot of effort into trying to think about and forging a different path, right? That respects and honors the human dignity of every single person. So while they're not, universal, well, this is not a universal pact, and I think the rise of Christian nationalism is an example of, an alternative
Yes,
approach
unfortunately.
to religion. I do think that there are definitely religious traditions within the Christian camp and churches and the like that have been really trying to forge forward with racial and social justice.
No, no question about that. And I don't mean to diminish that at all. And I mean, thank goodness for that.
Yeah.
It just seems like we're not winning.
Yeah.
It seems like the tide, is going in
Yes.
the opposite direction. And, I just have this feeling that we need to focus outside the church, not only within the church, let me put it that way,
Mhm.
in terms of the change that needs to take place.
Yeah. I mean, here I'll, maybe perhaps maybe clichely quote King, where he talks about the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I mean, I think history, particularly U.S. history, is replete with examples of, progress forward and then kind of retrenchment.
Yeah, yeah, that's
More
absolutely true.
progress forward and then retrenchment. I think that, the racial um, the racial outrage, the racial unrest, we'll call it, of 2020 provided an opportunity to kind of move forward, it would seem, with some of uh, the racial justice agenda in terms of having people think through what it means to be a more justice and inclusive, just and inclusive society. I think in our current moment, people might see this moment, and I would certainly agree as a time of retrenchment where we've made some progress and now we seem to be going back in the opposite direction. And I think that the struggle for justice, the fight for justice, the fight for equality, the fight for racial equality, there are just moments like that. But I think what it is,
Mhm.
on us is to, continue to forge a path forward, and not be boggled down by our contemporary moment, but recognize that, if we are to give up, then there will be no more pressing forward, right? And so I think that we
Mhm,
have to just
mhm.
kind of keep our eyes on the prize, which is really cliche. And I mean, there are a lot of bad things that are happening currently, and similar to several years ago, people's lives are being uprooted. But I think that should be the driving force for us
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
really push forward.
Amen. So here's another endorsement. This one was from Christoph D. Ringer, author of Necropolitics. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. The Religious
Necropolitics.
Crisis of Mass Incarceration in America, who says congregations and faith leaders will find enduring spiritual wisdom, innovative theological insights, and urgent social analysis to respond to the fierce urgency of now. Can you share with us what you see as some examples of wisdom and insight in particular out of the book?
Yes, I can. This is again going to be an opportunity to feature some of the contributions. So Lloyd and Martell has an essay in the anthology entitled "The Viral Nature of Racism and Emergent Disease," which is actually the essay subtitle.
Hmm.
But there she considers racism in the context of the global pandemic. So I think it's actually a really timely
Hmm.
piece because we're not that far removed from the lockdowns and the global pandemic. And in that essay, she argues that there were actually two concurrent pandemics, COVID-19 and racism, that she thinks are and sees as deeply intertwined and compounded by the devaluing of human life in a capitalist society. And so what she wants to do in that chapter is talk about that in some detail. And then inspired by the biblical concept of Jubilee, Martell crafts a kind of theological response that combats the viral plagues of racism and individualism. And so I think that's an essay that readers might find useful in terms of thinking through particularly racism in the context of something else that was also led to the death of many, in many cases, unnecessarily so, right?
Mhm.
Um, the, mis- uh, there's another essay in there by Paul Tjay entitled "A Homiletic Reflection on Reparations," and in that essay, he considers the case for reparations for Black Americans. And what he wants to do there is reflecting on the story of Zacchaeus in Luke 19, I think, um, as a biblical narrative that addresses systemic injustice by restoring resources to the oppressed. There, Paul argues that there is more at stake concerning reparations than just money. And so he wants to think through reparations by juxtaposing it with the Korean Japanese reparations
Hmm.
struggle to the ongoing fight for reparatory justice for Black Americans, right? And so those who are interested in the case for reparations and thinking about what reparations can be and how perhaps the biblical text might be useful for thinking through that might find that contribution useful in their own thinking.
Hmm. Hmm. Good. So overall, what would you say that you'd like readers to most likely take away from the book?
Um, I would probably say that religion and Christianity in particular has both enabled and combated racism and white supremacy. And here I've been using, these terms interchangeably, though analytically they can be different depending on, who you're using to think about what racism is or who you're using to think about what white supremacy is. That's a conversation for another time. But the point I want to make here is that religion has been used to both buttress, to advance racist and then white supremacist memes, and it also has been used to combat, to resist, and to push back against those forces, right? And so it's not a kind of um, universally good force or universally bad force. It is in large part been a mixed bag, so to speak. And so if we think about, the ways it's advanced, um, racism, white supremacy, we can talk about Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism. And there are several scholars who've written eloquently about the threat of white Christian nationalism to democracy. You mentioned the Public Religion Research Institute that provides research on what Christian nationalism is, how to talk about it, what it consists of. Again, I could talk about that, but that's another lecture for another time. Um, and so there are these entities that are studying what Christian nationalism is, and all seem to point to um, the threat that it poses, both to democracy, to our society, and the like, right? And so in the chapter that I contributed, one of the chapters I contributed, I talk about it being a kind of contemporary manifestation of white supremacy, and that it should be resisted. And others in the volume also talk about how white Christian nationalism must be resisted. Right. So that would be an example of religion being used to advance racism, white supremacy. But of course, there is a tradition of social justice fighting against white supremacists and racist forces. And so what we must do as we think about religion is to recognize that it has both been a force for good and a force for ill. And so what
Mhm.
we're trying to push in the anthology is to think about the role that religion can and must play in pushing forward a more just and equal society.
Good, good. So I mentioned earlier you're also working on a new book titled Black Community Building, Public Housing Reform and the Promise of an Alternative Model to Mixed Income Neighborhoods. So can you tell us about that book?
Sure. I'm laughing because the title of that book has changed so many times, so the when it's finally out, I'm sure I know the title will be different, but that book is basically an assessment of public housing reform in the U.S. So, for those who are not familiar with public housing reform, it's basically the effort to transform public housing properties in the U.S. into mixed income communities. And this has largely been done in high poverty neighborhoods that have been disproportionately in Black communities, right? And so what I'm doing in that work is evaluating the longitudinal impact of public housing reform for Black communities, arguing that this policy that several $billions has been invested in at the federal level has basically been the catalyst for the demise of
Mm,
vulnerable Black communities in U.S.
mm,
cities across the country. And so
wow.
I'm providing a kind of a longitudinal analysis of that impact and situating it within a larger history of kind of Black death. And I'm talking death, I'm using the word death here, both literal and metaphorically. And so I'm really basically trying to push for alternative ways of redeveloping these vulnerable communities. So that work, which I've been working on for several years, it's like, you know, it just never ends. That work, I'm hoping to actually finish the book this year, a solid draft at the very least, because it's actually due to the press next summer. And so if
Okay,
the editor
good.
is watching this and listening, I am working on it. We will get it
Good. Well,
hopefully
keep
soon.
us, is that going to be primarily an academic book or a trade book?
Yeah, so it's under contract with Georgetown University Press. So
Okay.
it is primary academic work, and it's going to be situated between two general fields, Black Studies and Urban Studies. And so both fields disciplines, depending on, how you understand Black Studies and Urban
Hmm.
Studies.
Well, it sounds interesting, even if it is academic intended.
Well, I'm writing it for, the question, it is an academic book, but I am aiming it for, people who are non-specialists, because I think it's actually, I want it to have an actual impact on
Good,
people's, it's not that for it to just be an academic exercise, but I'm actually trying to make a difference in the lives of the people who I'm writing about. So
good,
it's
good,
important
good.
that it's
Well, keep us
accessible.
posted so we can talk about that when the time is right.
Definitely.
Well, Michael, thanks so much, for joining us, and congratulations again on this and all of your work. It's much needed, and I appreciate it, and I'm sure many people do.
Thank you so much. I want to say thanks and appreciation to the National Council of Churches and the Faith and Order Table and all of my colleagues who helped to make this work possible. It would not have been possible without the work of every contributor, without the work of the associate editors, Whitney Wilkinson, Areche, and Don Thorson, and just everyone involved. So um, I, in certain traditions as I am because we are, and certainly this book was a team effort. And so I'm just grateful that it's out in the world and hopefully it's making a difference.
Yes, absolutely. So again, the name of the book is Confronting Racism and White Supremacy in the U.S., 21st Century Theological Perspectives. Please go to Michael's website. It's mrfisherjr.com. So mrfisherjr.com. Michael, thanks again and best wishes.
Thank you so much, Brian, for the conversation.